Presently, Australia finds itself entangled in a significant battle that has persisted for over 100 years, with the opposition seemingly on the verge of victory. However, this adversary isn't a foreign nation or a similar entity. Surprisingly, it's a collection of flightless birds, toads, and rabbits. This situation is peculiar on several fronts. For instance, neither the rabbits nor the toads are indigenous to Australia, and the emus are simply terrestrial avians. But how is such a scenario plausible? Why would Australia engage in combat with creatures that ordinarily wouldn't inhabit its landscape? And how has this conflict stretched out for 150 years? The narrative commences with the flightless bird, the emu, which ushers in an intriguing segment of the story. It was the 1930s, and Australia, mirroring the rest of the globe, was grappling with the Great Depression. Wheat market values were dwindling, compelling the Australian government to implement measures to bolster food output to nourish its populace. To this end, they approached farmers, offering them inducements to escalate production in the form of subsidy assurances. This strategy proved successful, resulting in a significant upswing in production. However, the government did not follow through with their promised assistance to the agricultural community. Compounding the problem, the emus had just finished their breeding season. This was a substantial issue because emus typically migrate post-breeding. Consequently, they began moving in great multitudes toward Western Australia, with a pack of up to 20,000 emus. Naturally, with such a large flock of birds, the quest for an equivalent amount of sustenance was imminent. Fortunately for the emus, the farmers had a substantial quantity of unsold wheat due to their refusal to sell to the Australian government as a form of protest against the unfulfilled subsidy promises. As a result, these omnivorous emus began to wreak havoc, devouring significant portions of the farmers' produce. Thus, the Emu War had been ignited, with Australia contending against an encroaching species that they needed to eliminate for their survival. Consequently, they assembled what they perceived as the most efficient strategy to emerge victorious from this unusual conflict. But what's the most effective method to battle an invasive species? After some deliberation, the Australian government arrived at an optimal solution: military intervention. This decision set the stage for the government's approval to deploy 2 soldiers, equipped with Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition, under the leadership of an army major, to eliminate the emus. Wait, 20,000 emus versus only 3 soldiers with 10,000 rounds of ammo? That sounds reasonable, apparently. Thus, the trio was dispatched to aid the farmers, permitted to assist under the singular stipulation that the farmers foot the bill for food, lodging, and ammunition costs. Therefore, by October, the soldiers were ready to commence their mission of exterminating the emus. 3 soldiers, 10,000 rounds of ammunition, against 20,000 emus. It was anticipated to be an easy task, or so it seemed, because even before the operation had officially begun, a complication arose. And while arithmetic wasn't a novel concept by this point, it wasn't the shortage of ammo or the small number of soldiers that posed the problem here. The problem instead was caused by torrential rainfall, which had led to the dispersion of emus across the plains, thereby making them tricky targets for the machine guns. As a result, the assault had to be delayed until the next month. On November 2 the mission was finally initiated. The soldiers had relocated to the small township of Campion, following reports of 50 emus sighted there. However, because the emus were beyond reach, locals tried to drive the birds into a trap. This plan, however, backfired and caused the birds to scatter in different directions. The soldiers still attempted to open fire on the fleeing emus, but their efforts resulted in the death of only around a dozen of these peculiar birds that day. With 12 down, 19,988 were left to go. Despite the initial day, not being particularly successful, the soldiers were poised to triumph. Only a few days later, the Major successfully orchestrated a trap for over 1,000 emus who were advancing directly toward their position. With their machine gun at the ready, everything seemed to be falling into place. The gunners took their positions, and, as soon as the birds came within range, they began to shoot. However, much to the chagrin of the eager soldiers, they managed to eliminate only about a dozen emus before their machine gun malfunctioned. By the time they rectified the gun issue, the birds had already dispersed. Another chance had been squandered, with only around 20 emu casualties to their credit. The Major and his team then resolved to venture south of Campion, hoping their fortunes might improve there. After all, the third time is often a charm, isn't it? Their decision appeared to be reasonable, considering the supposed docility of the emus in these parts of the country. If there was any location where they could achieve their objective, it would likely be here. However, much to their dismay, they were still unable to tally the desired number of kills. However, an intriguing revelation was made. The emu flock seemed to follow a leader who would stand guard against potential dangers, while the rest of the birds indulged in the Australian farmers' crops. Whenever this emu leader spotted the soldiers, it would signal the entire group, which would then disperse in all directions. Admittedly, this is a smart strategy. However, the Major was becoming increasingly frustrated with this hide-and-seek game between his trio and the surprisingly astute and swift flock of flightless birds. As such, he devised a new strategy. If the birds refused to approach him, he would bring the fight to the birds. Sounds logical, right? Thus, the decision was made to mount one of the Lewis machine guns onto the back of a truck, enabling them to shoot the emus while on the move. Sounds like a splendid plan, right? Well, as you can likely anticipate, this strategy did have its potential pitfalls, and they soon became evident. Despite 2,500 rounds of ammunition being discharged within a week, official records suggest that only about 300 emus were killed. The Army Major in command of the operation even drew a comparison between the birds' resilience and that of armored tanks. Oh, and there was also an incident where a fleeing emu became entangled in the truck's steering wheel, leading to the vehicle crashing into a nearby fence. As a result, the operation was deemed an outright failure and was temporarily put on pause. It was later resumed for a few more weeks, during which they experienced slightly better success. In the end, the three soldiers managed to kill just under 1,000 emus with their 10,000 bullets, translating to a respectable 10% hit rate. Interestingly, this led a politician to inquire if any medals would be awarded to the courageous participants of the Emu War. In response to this, a politician from Western Australia retorted that if any medals were to be awarded, they should indeed be given to the emus, who had consistently emerged as victors in every round. Though humorous, his point carried weight. Nevertheless, a solution had to be found to the emu problem, and all previous attempts had proved unsuccessful. Therefore, the Australian government took a seemingly radical step. Drawing inspiration from the Americans, they started providing local farmers with ammunition and firearms and offering rewards for every emu killed. This approach proved highly effective, and in 1934, a total of 57,000 emus were exterminated in a span of just 6 months. Since then, many thousands of emus have also been culled by the locals. As a result, the current estimated emu population in Australia stands at a steady 600,000 to 700,000. Therefore, after several trials and errors spanning numerous decades, Australia did finally manage to prevail in their first war against animals. Their animals, though it took several attempts and a considerable length of time, they eventually emerged victorious. However, it seems the Australian farmers were in need of a fresh challenge, as it wasn't long before they introduced a new pest to the Australian wildlife. In 1935, cane beetles were wreaking havoc on large sugarcane fields in the state of Queensland, which was severely affecting the productivity of the local farmers. In a desperate bid to protect their remaining crops, the Australian farmers turned their attention towards South America. Here, cane toads were being employed to consume pests that were damaging crops in these regions. From the Australians' perspective, these toads appeared to be an extremely effective solution to their pest problem. Therefore, they resolved to import 102 of these cane toads into Australia and release them into the wild. Shortly after releasing the toads, the farmers stumbled upon an oversight. The cane beetles they wanted to eradicate resided at the top of the sugar canes, whereas the cane toads remained at the base. This resulted from the toads' limited ability to jump or climb a crucial detail the farmers had neglected to investigate prior to their release. This fact rendered the toads effectively useless for their intended purpose. But there was an additional oversight that the farmers had not foreseen: the insatiable mating urge of these toads. The toads were known to attempt copulation with virtually anything, even inanimate objects like rocks, dirt clumps, and human legs. Another significant factor was that the toads mated year-round and could produce up to 30,000 eggs at a time. Most alarmingly, these amphibious creatures had no natural predators in Australia since they were non-native species. Further complicating their unchecked growth was the presence of toxic glands on their backs, which could poison almost all Australian wildlife. Therefore, they were left to breed without any substantial impediment, and breed they did. From the original 102 cane toads, introduced in 1935, their numbers have exploded to an estimated 200 million. As illustrated by the provided images, the cane toads have spread from the small coastal regions of Queensland, where they were initially introduced, to central and northern Queensland, covering thousands of miles. They have even made their way into the states of New South Wales and Northern Territory. Given their ability to travel up to 60 kilometers or 37 miles per year, no part of the country is immune from their invasion. There is no effective method to eliminate large numbers of these toads, and it seems they might become a permanent feature of the Australian wildlife. The only measure that has yielded positive results in the past was the temporary use of pesticides, which demonstrated significant efficacy. However, this method was abandoned when the pesticides were found to be carcinogenic to humans. Thus, the cane toad proved to be an unstoppable invasive species. Australia is still grappling with their ever-expanding presence, making it a clear victory for the toads. Yet, another non-native animal threatens Australia: the rabbit. Rabbits were introduced by British settlers who longed for the familiar pastime of hunting back home. Only 24 rabbits were imported into Victoria. However, the settlers underestimated the rabbits' reproductive potential and Australia's optimal conditions for their proliferation. The rabbit population exploded due to two key factors: Australia's mild winters allowed year-round reproduction, and the agricultural region where the rabbits were introduced provided ample food. The 24 imported rabbits, a mix of wild and domestic breeds, interbred to produce a hybrid well adapted to Australia's environment. Consequently, within a decade, these 24 rabbits multiplied into millions. Despite attempts to control their growth, including shooting, poisoning, and trapping, they remained resilient. In 1950, the myxoma virus was introduced to reduce their population, which temporarily fell from 600 million to 100 million. However, the rabbits developed resistance to the virus, quickly rebounding to between 200 and 300 million by the early 90s. Today, rabbits continue to thrive in Australia, marking a score of 2-1 for animals versus humans. Regrettably, another triumph for the animals may be looming, this time with hordes of mice swarming across eastern Australia. These mice population surges have been attributed to extreme weather changes, with severe droughts followed by floods creating ideal breeding conditions. As a result, mice are now multiplying in millions. Although it's too soon to predict the outcome of this situation, considering Australia's past struggles with invasive species, it wouldn't be a surprise if the mice have the upper hand. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next update.